I'm Chris Oppie. I'm a professor of history here at UMass and director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. So thank you all for coming, and for those who are watching online, it's my pleasure to introduce the inaugural Ellsberg activist in residence, Ira Helfand. The Ellsberg Initiative was inspired by Daniel Ellsberg, who in 1971 risked a life in prison for releasing to the public a classified history of the Vietnam War that revealed more than 2 decades of government lies about that war. When he was on trial, his case was dismissed. The judge really had no other choice, because at precisely that time, the Watergate investigation revealed that the Nixon White House had been committing crimes against Ellsberg to smear his reputation and to prevent him from leaking any other documents. So he's well known for that. What's not as well known is that he devoted the rest of his life, more than 50 years, to nonviolent activism on a variety of causes, the most important of which for him was nuclear disarmament. So the mission of the Ellsberg Initiative is to promote public awareness and scholarship and activism on those issues that were so important to Ellsberg. And so I think it's really fitting that we have among our programs an activist in residence, which we hope every year to bring to campus for a week. It's also, I think, very fitting that our first activist in residence is also, like Ellsberg, a person who has devoted a half a century to ending the threat of nuclear war. Dr. Helfand has really had 2 full-time careers, one as a physician and the other as an activist. So his life demonstrates that it really is possible to have a job and a family and also be deeply engaged in civil society efforts to make a better world. Dr. Helfand was one of the founders of Physicians for Social Responsibility and a past president. He was also a past president of Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Both these organizations received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. Then he went on to play an important role in the creation of the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, which some years ago introduced at the United Nations a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which has now been ratified by about 70 countries, is that right? And he's now really making great strides with an organization in this country called Back from the Brink. So for those of you who were here on Tuesday night, you'll recall that Dr. Helfand talked about why nuclear war is a serious threat, what would happen if a nuclear war was actually fought, and some of the things we can do to prevent it. Tonight's workshop is really going to try to dive deeper into the last of those topics. So, Ira.
So, can you hear me okay? I'm sorry, I really have a soft voice. I just want to start by saying a few words about activism in general. We should not need to be activists. If the people who are paid as their job to run our country were doing their job properly, we could go about doing whatever we wanted to with our lives. But unfortunately, that is not the case. It has not been the case. It probably won't ever be the case. And so it really falls on just normal citizens to look after the place. Some of you may make this your full-time career. You may go into government service yourselves, you go into NGO work, working on peace issues or social justice issues. Most of you probably won't. And you'll do other things. You'll be teachers, you'll be lawyers, you'll be doctors, you'll be engineers, whatever. It's important to figure out how you can, despite those other very demanding careers, do your part to keep the ship afloat. My own personal involvement in all kinds of activism was very much conditioned by growing up in the 1950s in a Jewish household in the shadow of the Holocaust. And it was largely hearing all the time that this would not have happened if only the good German people had done their job and resisted what the government was doing. And it was sort of, just sort of a foundational myth, story, whatever, in our childhood, that we have a responsibility to make sure our government isn't doing terrible things, to make sure it is doing things that it needs to do. And that lesson, there's that particular specific set of circumstances that I grew up with, but you're growing up with something very similar. You see the effects of the climate crisis in particular unfolding in real time before your eyes, with the full knowledge that the fossil fuel industry knew what was happening, and plenty of people in government knew what was happening for decades and did nothing. And so, it's basically the same lesson. If we, private citizens, don't take action in our lives, in our careers, in our private lives, bad things can happen. So, I think it's in that spirit that I've been I have been doing anti-peace work since the Vietnam days, a long time ago, anti-racist organizing even more so at that time, and anti-nuclear organizing for a very long time. But I've never done this professionally. It's not my job. I didn't work for the NGO. I went to be a doctor, so I went to school, and I did that. I had a full-time job as a doctor. And I'm spending a lot more time now since I retired, but during most of my career, I did some work. I spent 5 hours a week, maybe sometimes 10 hours a week, working on this issue. And that was a lot to me. It felt like a lot, especially when the kids were little. But it was doable. And it didn't require me to give up the rest of the life that I wanted to have. And I think that's an important message for people. To be an activist does not mean that you have to put your whole life into this. You can go out for dinner, you can go to the movies, you can go on a date, you can have kids. You can do all the things we're supposed to do, and still just spend a little bit of time working on the issues that need to be worked on. So we want to focus tonight on, as Chris said, on what it is that we are going to do about this problem. You all have heard my description of it. I think it's an accurate one, and I presume have some sense, as I do, that this is a really urgent problem that we really need to figure out how to deal with. So a little bit more about Back from the Brink than I explained the other night, and then I really want to focus on your thoughts about what you as students on this campus in particular can do about this. The Back from the Brink campaign was conceived of as a way of bringing the energy that was generated by the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons here into the U.S. political scene, understanding that the core goal of the international campaign, getting countries to sign and ratify the treaty, was going to be a total political non-starter here in the United States. That would, if the U.S. were to do that, it would be committing itself to unilateral disarmament. There's no way in the world that's going to happen. And so, how do we get around that? What do we do? Well, the idea we had was we're not looking for unilateral disarmament anyway. We're looking for universal disarmament. So our call became, how do we get the U.S. government to lead that effort? Because nobody else was doing it, no other country. And we came up with the idea that the key would be for the U.S. to, first of all, make this statement that I alluded to the other day, acknowledging that nuclear weapons must be eliminated. They aren't making us safe. And then to go out and try to convince the other 8 countries to join in the negotiations based on that premise. And by the way, I would just mention that, I don't know if people saw this, but I think it was yesterday morning, there was reported that the Chinese government has asked for the 9 nuclear weapon states to enter into negotiations now, not for the elimination of nuclear weapons, but for a treaty pledging no first use of nuclear weapons, which would be a useful step in the right direction. And I think that that call for negotiation to me is extremely hopeful, because it indicates a willingness of the Chinese and a desire on the part of the Chinese to enter into this kind of negotiation. So it's really in our court to get our government to pick this up and start doing it as well. And the other thing that we decided was that, well, we wanted this campaign, we needed to create a vehicle, basically, so that if we convinced people that they needed to help get rid of nuclear weapons, there'd be something they could do. Because it doesn't do any good to say, my God, this is a terrible problem, there's nothing I can do about it. We have to create a vehicle that people can use. And we thought that we wanted this to be something that individuals could get involved with, and individuals can. You can go to the website, and you can sign up as an individual, get emails, be advised of the activity of the campaign. But we really wanted to use this as a way, our tagline is bringing communities together to prevent nuclear war. Because we felt that people would be much more effective if they didn't do this work alone, but looked around them to the communities that they belong to and got them involved. So sort of outside the academic world, we're talking about people who belong to churches, getting their church congregation to join with them in support of this. If they belong to a union, trying to get the union to support them. If they belong to a professional association, as a unit to join in this effort. And that's where we've been most successful. We've gotten 400, at this point, 470 organizations, local, national, to join the campaign, bringing not just their individual members, but the strength that they as a collective organization have. And I think that really is something, when we look now at the academic community, what can we do here? I think the same kind of thinking applies. Individual students can be active. Students are going to have a much bigger impact if they do it collectively as a group. And there's specifically the group that's just started, Students of Nuclear Disarmament, and it would be, I think, really terrific if we were able to start a chapter of that here at UMass. But also, you all may belong to other groups already. The local Science for the People chapter. It'd be great if Science for the People, as an organization, endorsed this campaign and use some of its network to get out information about the danger of nuclear war. At heart, at the moment, this is overwhelmingly an educational campaign. We talk about the need to build political power, and we do need to do that. But we're not going to be able to build political power until we get a lot more people understanding the problem. And even the efforts that we undertake to get resolutions passed by government bodies, largely the impact that we're looking for is the educational impact. We know that HRS 77 is not going to pass this session of Congress. It won't get brought to a vote by the current leadership. But it's a way of reaching out, talking to members of Congress, educating them, and believe me, they need education about this, and then identifying those amongst them who do understand already, and the ones that we are able to educate about this, so they'll become leaders on this movement, because they have a platform. When a member of Congress or a member of the Senate speaks, they get a lot more attention than one of us does. So, in essence, we're trying to get them to amplify the message and build a broader understanding. As you've seen, as we've had this series of conversations in different classrooms and the lecture the other night, the vast majority of your peers do not yet know about this problem. And that is really the first hurdle we have to get over. How do we get them to understand the 2 points that we've been trying to drive home? Nuclear war is going to happen if we don't do something about it, and it's going to be worse than you can imagine. Because that is just not widely shared. Which to me is in some ways a source of great hope. Because what we've seen is when people in the current generation understand that they're facing an existential threat, like the climate crisis, which people do understand, they want to get active about it. So it leads me to think that the same will be true here. If we're able to educate students about the nuclear danger, they're going to want to do something about it. So, I mean, basically, that's all I want to say. If I were talking at you, and I apologize actually for doing as much as I have already. I'd really like to hear from you what your thoughts have been in the last couple of days since the lecture, since I met with you in class, about what you can do. And we're not going to go over and make everybody speak, but please do speak up. What thoughts do you have? How would you go about trying to build greater understanding on this campus and more activity on this campus? So, please. Yes.
Like you've inspired me to want to make a short kind of film, besides a documentary possibly, of just pop cultural media images, then that could be a way to maybe trigger, and not trigger, but in a way to activate in people of what death could look like, these images, from Atomic Cafe to other film.
I guess with like spiraling tensions, I know that we were like, especially right now, like the heightened alert for the use of nuclear weapons is now more precarious than ever, probably throughout any point in our history. And so I guess what policies, kind of pulling on like the past and I guess pertaining to today, what do you think would be the most pragmatic?
What do you think? How can students on this campus help to move that process forward?
The thing about the Pioneer Valley is like the 5 college system. I think if something could be done with that, that would be much more effective than just UMass, especially just UMass undergraduates.
I mean, it's a valid point of view. I think the question though then would be for a group of UMass students, how do we reach out to students on the other campuses? And I mean, I think if you're going to reach out to them, you have to perhaps, it's like we're asking people to donate to a cause. Will you join in supporting this cause? Reaching out to students at other campuses, will you join us on the UMass campus and working on this issue? So, an important insight perhaps, but that's, I think, a question to think about. How do we get that going? How do we reach out to them? Other thoughts about how to do this?
So I wanted to let everybody know about one possible way that this kind of organizing could happen, which is via the Environmental and Social Action Movement. So if people haven't heard of that yet, it's a group, it's really a coalition of student groups and the different unions on campus. So it kind of taps the infrastructural power of the union organizing on campus and also the amazing work that students are already doing. And so we have a variety. We operate on this kind of circle model, and so we have a general circle where we make decisions and organize for the entire group, but then circles organize around specific issues, and they have a lot of autonomy in terms of how they move forward with the issues that they're working on. So you may have heard of the Move Our Money Circle, which is working to build on the divestment from fossil fuels. I don't know your name, but when you started talking about film, that is, bringing creative talents. I think of the Yes Men, who are personal favorites of mine, and the totally wacky stunts that they've done. Very creative, very provocative, exciting ways to shake things up. There's art, there's street theater, there's all kinds of things. And then there's like the legislative stuff, the stuff that's like getting into figuring out how the political system works and that kind of thing. But I just, I think that there's so many different ways that people could approach this issue, and I'm excited to hear that people have, are already bringing those ideas into the room.
To go back to the congressional point, while Massachusetts delegation is, a few people have signed on to the Back from the Brink, but few haven't, right? I mentioned, I think, 4 or 5 the other night.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that would be one really obvious thing to imagine how impactful it might be if even just a half a dozen UMass students, made an appointment, with one of these representatives and, prepared, of course, with your, your arguments, and we want you to sign on to this series of proposals. See what happens.
There are 5 members of the delegation that have not endorsed the resolution yet. Congresswomen Chauhan and Clark, and Congressman Bolton, Auchincloss, and Keating. And that would be something that would be very valuable if there's a club here that could identify students who were constituents of each of these people and reach out to them. We have constituent groups in all those districts except for Congressman Moulton's that are working, trying to have a conversation with the members of Congress to get them to sign on. We've had preliminary meetings with all of them at this point and are seeking further meetings with them. But they listen to argument and they also listen to constituent presence. And so, getting a group of constituents, especially young constituents from the university who potentially could reach out to more people, that would carry significant weight with it. So that's something that would be an activity clearly to think about. If you got together a group of people here, that could be sort of a slightly more complicated to organize than, say, a film event on campus, but something also that would be a lot more impactful too, potentially. So something to be considering. If would there be interest here in like starting at UMass either a circle as part of? I'm sorry, you say it so quickly.
I'm sorry, Environmental and Social Action Movement, ESAM.
ESAM.
Yeah.
In forming a circle of ESAM or forming a UMass Students for Nuclear Disarmament, would people be interested in actually doing that, something like that? Because I think that's kind of in some ways the necessary first step. If you're going to have successful activism, it's hard to do it by yourself. You need to have a group. And there are lots of groups you can reach out to, but there needs to be somebody at the center of this, some group at the center that's kind of coordinating this and organizing the outreach and getting people together to figure out how to do that. So if you feel comfortable speaking to that, I'd really like to know if people would be inclined to do something like that. I'm not going to pick on people, but that really, to my mind, is some of the central question. Is there the interest to actually form an ongoing group that would work on this issue?
I think, I could speak for myself that I'd absolutely be interested in it. I think that perhaps there's even greater value than doing it in UMass-Amherst, which is, it's one college in one relatively small town, as opposed to there are students here from all over Massachusetts and then all over the country, and even a fair body of international students. And I find it shockingly few people participate in local government. So even if 10 students were to go to their local town hall meeting and advocate for nuclear disarmament, and advocate for people to write to their representatives and to sign on to newsletters and join groups for nuclear disarmament, I think it could have an even greater effect than just a group of students operating solely within Amherst.
That's a really good point. So you're saying sort of that they may be UMass students, but they would be seeing their job as reaching beyond the campus. That would be very powerful. You know, there are 20 of the communities in Massachusetts have passed resolutions. It's part of the Back from the Brink campaign. But there are lots of major communities that have Lowell, Lawrence, Framingham, New Bedford, Fall River, Fitchburg. You know, if you could get a group of, 6 or 8 students who all live in Lowell to go bring something to the Lowell City Council, and at the same time also perhaps bring something to Congresswoman Jahan, that would be really, that would be a very terrific kind of thing to outcome. But again, if that's going to happen, there has to be a group here that's bringing this together, that's both spreading the word to other students and coordinating students to do that. So, and we are talking not in as in-depth a way as I've been able to do here on this campus this week, but we're speaking at schools around the country in different places, trying to get the same kind of activity going. So a group that started here would have other groups around the country to relate to and be part of the national movement doing this.
I have no doubt that that something like that could be started at UMass. There's just enough people that there's enough within that group who would be interested. I don't personally know how to start a group like that. I don't know if anyone here knows how you would go about starting a group for the purpose of nuclear disarmament.
Anybody have thoughts about how you do that? Lily?
I've not started something. I've not started something of this magnitude. But I started a few clubs, and I think it kind of works as you tell your friends, and they tell their friends, and eventually, you stand outside the student union and you go, "Hey, look, we're having a meeting tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. You
Social
want to
media is
come?"
very useful.
Yeah, social media is very useful. Exactly.
Google Forms, never hurts.
Yeah, in a month you could have 200 people just through a connection via friends.
Get some T-shirts.
Yeah.
Back from the Brink has some pretty cool T-shirts.
I think it's an important question because it's not immediately obvious, but it's not, I think as Lily was suggesting, it's not that complicated a process. I'll tell you how we started Physicians with Social Responsibility, which is we decided we wanted to have the group. We said next Thursday in the evening we're going to have our first meeting, and there were like 3 or 4 of us. There are more of you here now, and we're all going to talk to our friends about it. I was an intern at the time. We're going to talk to the other interns and residents and some of the younger family docs and see if they want to come. We had a meeting with 10 people. We sort of sat down and said, okay, so what's going to happen next? We have a vehicle. We've got the group. What's the project going to be? So the project was we're going to organize a medical grand rounds. That's a lecture. Once a week there's a lecture at a hospital in which you talk about a medical issue. We're going to get the administration to having medical grand rounds about the nuclear question. And that was our project for the first 2 months that we got it. And on from there. So, I think if you were inclined to do that, you could do that. You could say, we're going to have a meeting next Thursday at 7 o'clock in this room or some appropriate place that people congregate in easily. And you're all going to go out and talk to your friends about it and see if you can get other people to come. And you're going to have a project that you'll work that out that night. How are we going to do this work? We know that we need to educate more students. We know that we need to both do the things that educate them and also give them something to do going forward. What's that going to look like? You figure it out. Gus is smart.
People are heavily emotionally charged about this topic, so that could be something that could have this come unglued before it starts. I'm not saying it would, but there's a possibility of that happening, for sure.
I think perhaps it would be good to link it to something that at first might seem completely unrelated, but the idea that nuclear annihilation could start. If Biden wanted to, he could end the world before we finished this meeting right now. As you said on Tuesday, it takes 15 minutes for the world to end if one man chooses to end it. And you could link that, it sounds a little ridiculous to say the undemocratic nature of nuclear warfare, but to say, well, why should we have anyone be able to do it, but much less one person be allowed to do it? You could tie it to something like Roe v. Wade, where the vast majority, I think it's like 60% of the country was opposed to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And you could say, how come these 9 justices are able to overturn what hundreds of millions of people oppose? And you could say it's entirely undemocratic, except as catastrophic as the overturning of Roe v. Wade was, the use of nuclear bombs would be, or nuclear warheads would be even more catastrophic. It would be the most catastrophic thing that you could possibly imagine.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, you could even take it a step farther and say that how can you have a democracy when you have nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons are inherently undemocratic. You could throw on one person the right to destroy the world. That's not just scary, but that's fundamentally undemocratic. And I do think that, in recent years, to the extent that Americans have worried about nuclear weapons, they tended to worry about a bomb getting in the hands of a terrorist or being used by a so-called rogue nation. Not keeping in mind that there are 9 nuclear armed countries, including our own, which is as likely to use one through accident or some cyber attack that Dr. Helfand was talking about before, as is any of the other 9.
I don't know how much people are paying attention in the student world to these kinds of questions. I mean, Putin's statement this morning was shocking, and I don't know if that registered at all on campus. I suspect it probably didn't register a lot. But as you're suggesting, the situations exist. The information is out there. It's a question of using it and getting people to pay attention to it. The other area that I think, to my mind, might be a very fruitful way of approaching this is the climate question, because so many students are aware of the climate crisis and are concerned about it and are active about it. The argument that I made the other night, which is derived from Bill McKibben, the great climate activist, is that this is where climate change is taking us. If in a world wrecked by the climate crisis, nuclear weapons are going to be much more likely to be used. And that is an argument which I think people who are involved in the climate movement really might respond to. If they explain to them how this is what's going to happen. We're not going to wait for the sea to rise 10 feet. We're going to blow ourselves up before then. So let's focus on this part of the problem as well. Here's a movie that you guys might want to consider showing, because it's short. It's only 40 minutes long. It's called not War Games, but The War Game. And The War Game was a BBC documentary that was made in the 1960s. It's in black and white. It is, I think, the most powerful depiction of the immediate effects of nuclear war that's ever been made. And it's partly because it's not total nuclear war. There are a lot of survivors, and a significant portion of the movie shows what their life is like in the time after the war. But there's also, even though...
Threads? Have you seen Threads on the
I haven't seen Threads.
Straight to
It's
the
much very
television. Huh?
It's supposed to be really wonderful also.
Oh yeah.
This regard. So, what I was saying is that with this movie, although it doesn't have a lot of high-tech special effects, its depiction of the moment when the war starts is just incredibly powerful and emotional. And it's available online. It's only about 40 minutes long, which is nice because you can show it at a meeting for 40 minutes and then have a discussion 20, 30 minutes afterwards. The day after is almost 2 hours long, I think. But this is a much shorter piece, and it is unbelievably powerful. I saw it for the first time when I was a college student, and I remember they showed it in the basement of a church. And when the movie was over, I was one of 4 people who fell over a chair because we were just stumbling out of the room and didn't even see what we were walking into. I felt really weird, except everybody else was doing it too. It was a very powerful movie, The War Game.
So Something that you mentioned in lectures in the beginning of the semester, and something that I think we will probably run into if we make this group and if we continue, is you mentioned how a lot of people do not, especially people my age, do not get into any sort of sustained involvement in trying to change foreign policy because they feel like they're stupid or they feel like there's no point. And everyone here today is clearly more inclined to do this than the people that you were referring to. But how do we avoid that? How do we avoid like this becoming something that, instead of just being for like leftists, say, is just for like intellectuals? Because I do think that
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think that feeling I don't know enough is a real stumbling block to movement building. And I think the way to address it is you don't have to know everything, but you know enough to take a first step, and then you can learn more. And education is part of movement building. So you learn as you go. But the other thing is to address the hope, the sort of the question, it won't do any good. I think you could use examples like that Dr. Helfand mentioned. No one in the early 80s was optimistic that significant nuclear treaties would be signed by the end of the decade. In the larger context, no one was anticipating that the Cold War would come to an end. No one was anticipating that Nelson Mandela would not only be released from prison, but become the leader of his country 10 years later. So, things happen, and those don't just happen in the vacuum. There were movements pushing for change in South Africa, pushing for an easing of Cold War tension. So, there are success stories that you have to hold on to.
I think I think that's incredibly important part of the response. But another part is to understand that this idea that ordinary people aren't smart enough or aren't informed enough to have an opinion about this is something which is actually cultivated by, in this case, by the nuclear elite. During my time in college, it was around the Vietnam War. We know things that you don't know was the answer we got when we tried to organize protests against the war. And I think we have to push back against that. It's partly the democracy question that people talked about before. We do need to listen to experts, but we also need to form our own opinions. And frankly, nuclear war, the politics of nuclear war are not rocket science. The technology may be rocket science, but the politics aren't. The stuff that I've talked about in the several lectures over the last few days, this is really pretty simple, straightforward stuff, and the information is easily available. There's several versions of my talk that are available. I've got it, the course speech I give is written out, and it has all the data, and there are many resources on the ICANN website, on the BRINC website, preventnuclear.org. And I think we just need to be clear with ourselves and the people who bring it. Look, you don't have to have a PhD in this field to know that it's stupid to have nuclear weapons or all going to die. This is a fairly simple message. And not to allow yourself to be cowed by this false narrative that you need to be an expert. I think pretty feisty as a doctor. I used to run into people all the time who, the fact that they didn't know anything about medicine did not in any way deter them from telling you what their care should be. And so I think we can overcome that.
It's coalition.
There's a rich history of activism in this country, which can both be a source of inspiration to us because it has often been successful, and also a place to go to learn some of the details, the techniques of what works and what doesn't work. Obviously, what works and what doesn't work changes with time. And for example, as several people have pointed out, social media is new and gives enormous opportunities for organizing that didn't exist previously. When we started Physicians with Social Responsibility, we didn't have the internet. To communicate with each other, we had phone trees. I would call a doc and he would call 5 docs and each of them would call 5 docs. So in many ways, there are tools available today that just weren't available before. But there's still a lot that can be learned from some of these past movements in terms of the kinds of things that work. And especially that messaging about the power of ordinary citizens. The civil rights movement is maybe the clearest example of this. about the Vietnam War, movement to stop the war in Vietnam. They were just ordinary citizens, ordinary students who taught themselves. They got informed. I mean, one of the main things that we did in the Vietnam movement was to hold teach-ins, where people would come to explain. And it was not, as we had been told, the facts that we had been fed, that there was a different history that actually was more representative of reality. And in the same way, the information that we've been talking about at these several meetings about nuclear war, that needs to get out. But that's one of the activities that people can be engaged in, is figuring out how to do that. So you have all, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted, I have to go and take care of my kids, but I just wanted to say one other thing before I leave, which is, building on what you were just saying. I also think people don't need to be afraid of how few people there are in the room. There are 3 or 5 people can do an amazing amount of organizing work. In fact, in some ways it's easier, if you have a core group that's relatively small doing actual organizing. Of course, you want lots and lots of people to kind of build the whole. Colleague Tom Crow, who was married to the legendary Francis Crow, who was a tremendous inspiration to many of us in the anti-war movement in the Valley. I remember when I first moved here, and I would show up for meetings on a Friday afternoon, and I'd be racing to get there, and sometimes she was the only person in the room. And this is a person, first name basis with Amy Goodman. Amy Goodman came to her 95th birthday party kind of thing. She's like super important internationally, but she had no problem being the only one sitting in the room, like maybe waiting for one other person to show up. And then, a few people would show up and we would get stuff done, and we did amazing work together. So just to say, like, if this list, gets started and there's like 3 of you who show up to the first meeting, that's totally fine, and just keep plugging along and reach out to more people if you need support, because we're definitely out there too.
Really good point, especially where you've already identified other groups that you might be able to connect with. So even if they don't all come to your meeting, you make a plan and then you reach out to this club or that club and ask them to do a specific thing. And if there are 10 clubs that you can reach out to, and you have 10 clubs that are all doing something, that becomes very significant very quickly. One of the best meetings I ever attended was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I was asked to come up and speak. I drove up to Portsmouth. It's about a 3-hour drive. And I got there, and there were 10 people. And they were so embarrassed that I'd come all this way to talk to 10 people. I said, no, let's talk. So we had a meeting, and those 10 people went out and organized the state of New Hampshire around this. They got 10 different resolutions passed in cities and towns in New Hampshire. They're now getting the congressional delegation on board. So that point is really important. Well, great. Thanks all for coming. Again, if people want to come up and chat amongst yourselves, go right ahead. But we can sort of break this up so people don't feel bad about leaving.
Yeah, thanks, Ira.
Okay, thank you all for coming.